Let's begin with a question. How many of you are familiar with Hendy and Dawson? The names Hendy and Dawson. I see Pete Irvin nodding, yeah. Nancy, are we getting some affirmatives? Yeah, Hendy and Dawson really coined the principles of wilderness stewardship. They came up with 13 principles that they introduced actually a few decades ago now, and it's literally textbook stuff. I've uploaded that to the chat window if you care to see what they are, but that's really just context. Those principles, well, we had a difficult time remembering all 13, but many of them applied outside of wilderness as well. And the Carhart Center years ago distilled those down into 4 essential principles that really characterized wilderness stewardship. What made wilderness stewardship different than the stewardship of other lands? And they were the filter that was to be applied with respect to the preservation of wilderness character. So the idea is to apply these principles to preserve wilderness character. So with that, and hopefully some of you were in Linda Marigliano's session before this one, so this should be fresh in your minds. How many of you think you know all 5 qualities of wilderness character? You don't have to list them all, I just want to know how many people think they know all 5. Oh, got a few raised hands. Hey, Ellen, you raised your hand first. Can you list them all in the chat window? How are we doing, Nancy?
We've got undeveloped and untrammeled.
Excellent. What else?
Let's see, how about Nick? Can you type in, we have outstanding opportunity?
Very good.
OSPER. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.
Natural.
Yep, this should look familiar. If you haven't committed these to memory yet, it's best you do at some point. This really is the crux of all things wilderness. This is why we have jobs. This is why we're here this week. And that's what this presentation is all about, is the preservation of these 5 qualities of wilderness character. If you were in the last session, you got a good introduction to those qualities. If you did not attend the last session and you're not really clear, you'll have to go back and check out the Keeping It Wild 2 document. There's some great definitions in there. I strongly encourage that you do that. Okay, so to help us preserve those 5 qualities of wilderness character, the 4 cornerstones are: manage wilderness as a whole, preserve wildness and natural conditions, provide and use the minimum necessary, and protect wilderness benefits. Let's jump right into the first one, manage wilderness as a whole. We always come back to the language of the Wilderness Act. Whenever we talk about wilderness stewardship, everything's anchored there. Unfortunately, the way it was written, everything you need is there. Notice the phrase in red here: an enduring resource of wilderness. Probably escaped most people, but the word resource is singular. Wilderness is its own resource. We all know it's made up of a lot of other parts, right? But wilderness is its own resource and deserves to be considered as its own resource. I like to break the parts up this way. I like to classify them this way. You can do it any way that makes sense to you, but it helps to kind of keep in mind how big this resource really is and how complicated this resource really is. Biological components, physical components, and social components. These are by no means exhaustive lists, but just a way to get you thinking about the different parts of the resource, and you all represent one or more of these parts. The biological components, everything that is alive, that's kind of intuitive, right? But don't forget local, regional, and global biotic context. Wilderness does not exist in a vacuum. It'd be a lot easier to manage if it did, but it doesn't. The physical components, you might say these are the non-living things, unless somebody wants to argue with me about soil. Any soil scientists in the room? Raise your hand, I gotta know. Okay, we'll let that one lie. Don't forget the size, geolocation, elevation, and climate. These things do affect the biophysical resource. And then the things most people are more familiar with, perhaps the social components. Recreational opportunities, health and wellness, cultural significance, and a host of other reasons that people value these places. These are all parts of this very complex, very nuanced resource. You've got to consider all of these components when you're making wilderness decisions. So the implication is you need to know what they are, right? Every wilderness is different. Every wilderness is made up of a different set of components. If you don't know what the components are of your wilderness, if you don't understand all of the parts of your wilderness, get to know them. That's job one. You've got to know it. You've got to know it so you can make responsible decisions. Avoid maximizing only one component or part at the expense of the others. This undermines the integrity of the resource as a whole. This is kind of the issue with the day trap. How many of you come into work every day and the job is different than it was the day before? Well, that happens to me at least weekly, and I'm sure it happens to you. A really common trap here is emphasizing a single resource like the recreation resource or the wildlife resource, or worse, one species within the wildlife resource. Avoid maximizing one component. You will lose other components if you do that. Manage all components holistically towards a common end. And what, pray tell, is the common end? At this point in the National Wilderness Skills Institute, you should have a pretty good idea what the answer is. Preserve wilderness character. That's always the common end. By themselves, all these parts are pretty impressive. Together, they're extraordinary. Linda Merigliano stole this graphic from me, I think, and used it in the last presentation. So apologies if you were there for that. I'm using it a little differently. The point here is that wilderness is a synergistic resource. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. When you start removing parts, you lose synergy. You lose wilderness. And just a quick language check here. Wilderness resources aren't quite the same as the wilderness resource. The wilderness resources, plural, are all of these parts we're talking about: air, water, soil, recreation, and so on. The wilderness resource is the aggregate of all of those parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Okay, quick fact check. Does the Wilderness Act supersede other federal laws? I'm going to pause for a moment, Nancy, so you can see answers in the chat window. Does the Wilderness Act supersede other federal laws?
No. Our first answer.
73 people in the room. Some of you must have answers.
There must be more. Some. No.
Someone said some, huh? That's good. That's interesting.
Yes. We had a yes and a no.
Okay. The answer is no. All applicable laws must be satisfied unless a law says otherwise. And the take-home point here is that the Wilderness Act has the same teeth as any other law that we work with. Endangered Species Act, NEPA, and so on. Many of you work with multiple laws, and the Wilderness Act is just another one of them that has exactly the same force of law as any other law. And that comes in handy sometimes when you get into your little shouting matches in the office about whose law is bigger than whose. What about other purposes for which an area was established? Some of you might have research forests, others maybe on different agencies, maybe you have a wildlife refuge that was established for a purpose, or maybe you're a national park that has a different purpose. What about those things? Is wilderness more important, or are those other purposes more important?
Go ahead and pop in what you think into the chat. Equal.
Yeah, whoever said equal, that's the answer. Wilderness is within and supplemental to all of the other purposes for which an area was established. This is essentially a different way of saying the same thing as the answer above. All applicable laws apply equally unless Congress says otherwise. Once in a great while they say otherwise, but that's fairly rare. Okay, key points from this cornerstone. Wilderness is a singular resource with a lot of parts. If you don't know all of the parts, Learn them. Job one, learn the parts. Avoid maximizing one part at the expense of the others. This will undermine the integrity of the wilderness as a whole. You'll lose parts. You'll lose synergy. Manage all the parts holistically and synergistically toward the single end, the preservation of wilderness character. Keep the parts. And all laws and the purposes for which an area was established must be satisfied. Unless Congress says otherwise, they all have equal weight. Part of the job of a wilderness manager is trying to figure out how to follow multiple laws and comply with all of them. Aldo Leopold, the key to intelligent tinkering is to keep all of the parts. I love this quote. What I find this the reason I find this so interesting is that Leopold and Sennheiser were buddies, right? They were both after the same thing. They were both on the same team pursuing permanent wilderness legislation. Leopold was a wildlife biologist. He was a tinkerer. He believed that the way to manage wilderness was to manage it for the maximum amount of life it could support. That's very much a wildlife manager's kind of thinking. Sennheiser had a very different thinking. He embraced the word untrammeled. That's where that came from, was Sennheiser. And he didn't believe we ought to be tinkering at all. In fact, he thought the highest and best value of wilderness was the fact that it was untrammeled, that we did not tinker with it. So can you imagine these two guys having a conversation over coffee? That's a great segue into the next cornerstone. Preserve wildness and natural conditions. You're going to love this one. The Wilderness Act is packed full of language that suggests two core principles. One of them, maximize natural condition. Maximize natural condition. The other one is minimize modern human influence. So I'll say that again, it really does bear repeating. Maximize natural conditions, minimize modern human influence. Section 2A talks about natural condition. 2A also talks about unimpaired. 2C in the definition of wilderness talks about untrammeled. Also in the definition of wilderness talks about primeval character and influence. Wait, there's more. Natural conditions appear again in section 2C. And forces of nature in section 2C. Are you seeing a theme here? Maximize natural condition, minimize modern human influence. That's what all this language conveys. Okay, let's get some terms out of the way. So wildness is a synonym for untrammeled. Some people say it puts the wild in wilderness. So when you hear someone use the word wildness, someone in the wilderness community at least, use the word wildness, they're really talking about untrammeled. And hopefully you got a good definition of that from Linda. This is the action side of the equation. An untrammeled wilderness is one in which we are not imposing our will on the earth and its community of life. It's self-willed. Naturalness. This is probably a little more intuitive for folks. This is the effect side of the equation. This is a condition. And this speaks to the effects of both our actions as well as actions outside of our control. It's the degree to which an area is natural. Okay, I'm going to give you a short case study to try to illustrate the tension between these two terms. Hopefully you saw this building. Wildness versus naturalness. Bighorn sheep throughout the western US started to disappear back in the 60s, actually almost had disappeared by the 60s in many places in their native range. And through very aggressive actions by state and federal agencies over the subsequent years, they made a heck of a comeback and are doing very well now in most of their native range and some places that weren't their native range. But now we're starting to see some sudden declines, and they're alarming. Some of them are very sudden indeed. We're losing entire herds in places, largely due to disease transmission from domestic livestock. It's a form of pneumonia that they catch, and bighorn are very sensitive to this strain of pneumonia. It kills them very quickly and takes out the whole herd in short order. So you're a wilderness manager. You're watching your native population of bighorn disappear. Are you concerned? Yeah, I would hope you're concerned. It might compel you to do something. We all have these innate action biases, right? We want to do the right thing, we want to do it quick, and we want to do it hard. You might be inclined to do this, try to figure out what's going on with the sheep. So this is a net gun. Hopefully you can see that image on your computer, but there's an orange net being fired out of that helicopter. So you might capture, color, sample, even inoculate these critters to try to figure out what's going on with them. You might put a radio collar on them and track them to see where they're going, so you get an idea of how much contact they might be having with those domestic populations. You might do that. Or you might do something like this, right? You might control predators if you think that might help the population. Or you might provide supplemental water in some places if you think that might help the population. There could be other things you might do. Perhaps you'd limit hunting, or perhaps you'd limit dogs, because dogs do displace bighorn sheep. So there might be other things you might do too. So what's wrong with any of these pictures? Use the chat window and tell me what you see here and here. I'll give you a moment to respond. What's going on with wilderness character here and here?
While we're waiting for people to respond, Ken, we had a good question from Kelly. She's unclear how past human influence, indigenous peoples, as opposed to modern human influence, is being actively incorporated into the definition of natural state, especially since it was deemed so important by many people all of yesterday. She'd like some examples or clarification so she can figure out how to incorporate it into her wilderness area.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a very deep rabbit hole, but I'll provide a short answer that hopefully is satisfactory. When you think about the mandate of the Wilderness Act, which is to preserve wilderness character from the date of designation forward, first of all, I want to start you thinking about how natural was the place at the time of designation, because that's our bullseye. It's got to be at least that natural, right? In order to honor that federal mandate, it can't ever become less natural than it was at the time of designation. So you don't really have to think that far back. But if you're lucky enough, and I do mean lucky enough, to be in a position to do better than what things were at the time of designation, then you really have to start answering those tough questions. What does natural really mean? And what was the role of Native Americans in that word, in natural? And that's, there are all kinds of schools of thought on that and all kinds of research papers written on that. And I won't dive into the details of the different philosophies there, but I would suggest to you that most people think pre-European settlement is kind of a good bullseye if you can get there. You may never get there with climate change and other influences, but it's a nice place to which to aspire. And I hope that helps. And that hopefully also values and does not undermine the contributions that Native Americans made to what is natural in these places. I should recognize those influences. So we don't even have to have that conversation really, but we can. We just need another hour for it. Does that help?
Ken. Yes, thank you. And I'll read you some of the answers to your question. We have mechanized transport, installations, trammeling actions, a question, degrading wilderness character, numerous types of wilderness character being degraded, human management actions are impacting the wilderness, not necessarily better or worse, just different, not wilder.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. So yeah, let's go back here. The problem that is triggering the discussion is a decline in the natural quality. Are we agreed? Hopefully we're agreed. I'm used to doing this with a live audience, so apologies for the cues. But the natural quality is what's concerning us here. We're losing bighorn. Okay, taking this action is a trammeling action. It involves installation, it involves aircraft landing. Sometimes these sheep don't even survive. It affects natural condition. So this is like a triple whammy, probably a quadruple whammy. It affects almost every quality of wilderness character, including solitude, right? Because if you're anywhere within earshot of this aircraft, you know this is going on. So there's some pretty heavy impacts there. And those collars stick with us a while, don't they? Okay, same thing here. So if you're going to do predator control, you're trammeling. If you're going to put in guzzlers, you're putting in an installation and affecting solitude as well. You're degrading the undeveloped quality, correct? So you see where this goes. You really, you're stuck. Do you let the natural quality degrade? Do you lose your bighorn sheep? Or do you degrade other qualities trying to save them? This is the crux of wilderness stewardship in the 21st century, guys. So what you gonna do? Let's tackle the elephant in the room. You guys don't have any elephants, hope you'll settle for a bear. Anything you do is gonna degrade the untrammeled quality. Hopefully you're clear on that by now. If we take action to manipulate the earth and its community of life, we are trammeling. On the other hand, if you don't do something, you may lose something very important too, right? We may lose the bighorn sheep in this example, and that's not good either. And if you take action, you could make a mistake, right? We could have unintended negative consequences that we didn't expect to wilderness character. We're not as smart as we think we are. Frank Hegler said, ecosystems are not only more complex than we think, they're more complex than we can think. So how the heck can you restore degraded natural conditions? How can you fix a problem like this without trammeling? You can't. You can't. So this isn't about whether or not you're going to avoid degrading a quality of wilderness character. Something is going to be degraded. This is where your judgment comes in, and hopefully a lot of science. You're going to have to try to figure out what is going to best preserve wilderness character as a whole. These are tough, tough, tough choices. I'm going to give a nod to the Leopold Institute, especially since the director is on the line with us here, Jason Taylor. Peter Landris, before he retired, and what's Beth's last name? Beth?
Han.
Han, yes, and others spent literally years, I think it was about 3 years, trying to come up with a tool that would help you negotiate this. And they did. They came up with something called, loosely called the Ecological Intervention Framework. It's used as a supplement to the MRDG. I've uploaded that to the chat window, but probably right at the top of the chat window. You can download that at your leisure and see it. You can also find it on Wilderness Connect. Essentially, it's boiled down to these questions. These are older questions, but I continue to ask them this way. I think this is simpler than the framework, but the framework is more robust. What do you know about the problem? Do you really understand the cause and the effect? Are you using the best available science? Really got to be careful to avoid overgeneralizations and simplifications, borrowing information from other sites. Every one of these situations is different. Every wilderness is different. Make sure you give it the attention it deserves, and make sure you are comfortable that you know what you need to know before you get any further down this road. Mistakes made in wilderness can be irreparable. What's your probability of success? Or flip it, what are the consequences of failure? What happens if you screw up? We don't know as much as we think we know. We find that out all the time. Use the best science. Another plug for Leopold. Is action really necessary? Do you have to do anything at all? This is the untrammeled part of the equation, right? And this is also step one of the MRDG, right? It's the first question we ask. Do you have to do anything? What if you don't? How bad can it get? What are you willing to live with? And of course, what are the effects on wilderness character? And really the question here is, this is tricky. Which quality of wilderness character is more important in this case? Wildness or naturalness? That's untrammeled or natural. Which one is more important right here in this case? You are going to make that judgment call. Somebody has to.
Ken, we have a question that actually is about wilderness character. What is the appropriate balance between national consistency and local relevance in preserving wilderness character?
It's a good question, and I would direct you to the Wilderness Character Monitoring Framework in Keeping It Wild 2. National consistency is really well established all the way up to the measures level. or all the way down to the measures level, depending on how you're looking at it. So you have a very high level of consistency until you get down to how you're measuring an indicator, and then it's largely local. So there's a lot of flexibility for adapting to local conditions, but only at that measure level. Does that answer the question?
I think so. If we need any more clarification, Nick, please go ahead and type in the chat.
Okay, that was a little bit of a tangent, but a good question. I appreciate the question. Key points of this cornerstone: actions taken to promote naturalness compromise wildness and can have unintended effects. Be careful. Avoid overgeneralizations and simplifications. Apply only the best science. Make sure you know what you think you know. Of course, if you don't know what you don't know, this is why you have other people at the table, right? Nobody should be having these conversations by themselves. Bring your experts to the table. Be aware of your action bias. We all have them. We all want to do stuff. Step back, slow down, think about what you have to do and what you don't have to do. Balance both wildness and naturalness to maximize wilderness character as a whole. I would rephrase that to say, keep your eye on the ball being wilderness character as a whole. You may have to break a few eggs to bake that cake, if you know what I mean. But make sure that those benefits in the end are long-term and you're reasonably certain you're going to realize them, and the sacrifices are small and temporary. Administrators should be told that they're successfully measured not by projects accomplished, but by projects sidetracked. Adolph Murray, I love this. How many of you have ever been in a performance review and been told, congratulations, Nancy, you sidetracked 7 projects this year, here's an award. So you have to work with your line officers, your leadership, your supervisors to make sure they understand that a big part of the job of wilderness stewardship is knowing when not to do something. Not just knowing when to do something. All right, third cornerstone, provide and use the minimum necessary. I should say there's going to be a lot more depth on this cornerstone this week. See, tomorrow there's going to be a discussion about prohibited uses. And Thursday, there's going to be a discussion about the MRA and MRDG, which will go a different direction than this presentation. We'll try to keep this a little higher level. Okay, first, back to the language of the Act. It's clear that the Act intended that we not occupy and modify all areas within the U.S. Well, with our tools and technology, it's pretty easy for us to occupy and modify. We can occupy and modify the crap out of anything pretty quickly, right? It's only by restraint that we choose not to do that. And wilderness is the place for that restraint. Wilderness is different than other places we manage. It's different by definition. This comes out of the definition of wilderness in section 2C. I'll give you an example of one of those differences. Wilderness is the only place in which the American people are promised the opportunity to escape modern human civilization to the greatest extent possible. It's the only place they're promised that. It's also the only place we manage for untrammeled. This is all about the preservation of wilderness character, and these two qualities of wilderness character are the ones generally affected by this cornerstone: undeveloped and outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive unconfined type of recreation. To ensure we honor that mandate to preserve wilderness character, there were 10 things that were prohibited in section 4C of the Wilderness Act. 8 of the 10 things, those things that are listed on the screen in front of you, can be exempted if they are necessary to meet minimum requirements for the administration of the area for the purpose of this act. Really important language. You're going to spend more time, hopefully this week, breaking this language down and talking about what it means. The Carhart Center's developed multiple courses around this, and the MRDG came from this. In fact, it's the genesis of the minimum requirements analysis. That comes from this language. And this language really speaks to this cornerstone: provide and use only the minimum necessary. I want you to go beyond the MRA though, beyond the minimum requirements analysis, beyond the MRDG, and retrain your brain to think minimally. That does not mean think as little as possible. Quite the opposite. It means when action is absolutely necessary, favor the least amount of a prohibited use or uses because you have to, right? The law requires that anyway. Favor traditional tools and methods because that allows you to achieve the first one. That's a no-brainer, but it goes well beyond prohibited uses and traditional tools. Favor limited and indirect off-site visitor controls. Natural materials and primitive appearance. Why does that matter? People always want to talk about this one, so I'll throw out an example. A trail bridge is an installation. It's a prohibited use. An installation's an installation's an installation, right? What if one bridge is built out of native timber and another bridge is built out of steel truss? Does that make a difference? I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, it does make a difference. Now, they both degrade wilderness character. They're both installations. They both degrade self-reliance, that primitive part of wilderness recreation. They both degrade the undeveloped quality. That said, sometimes we find them necessary, but they can have greater and lesser impacts, right? That log structure is going to have a lesser impact on solitude than some of those other options. Actions that preclude future action. This is sometimes an unpopular thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I like to go in once, go in hard, do it right, and do it quick. That is not always the best solution, but what I really hate is when we set ourselves up to have to keep going back and retreat and retreat and retreat. We're definitely in a band-aid mode, many of us, because of budget, time restrictions, other priorities, and we do a lot of band-aiding things together. That just means we have to go back and do it again. And every time we go back, we set ourselves up for a new set of impacts to wilderness character. I'm a big supporter of doing it once and doing it right and getting out. That's not always pretty, but in most cases, I believe that's a better option. Lasting long-term benefits. Make sure those benefits are lasting and that the benefits justify the means. And you need to be pretty certain about that before you choose to do anything in wilderness. Favor resource protection, not visitor convenience. Another unpopular thing to say. We don't do anything in wilderness for visitor convenience. Nothing. Everything is done for resource protection. Trails aren't there for visitor convenience, they're there for resource protection. Bridges aren't there for visitor convenience, they're there for resource protection. Anything we put out there, same answer. Okay, I want to challenge you to think about all the things that you do in your wilderness, and we do a lot of things in wilderness. Some of the pictures I'm going to show you, you're going to find okay, and some of them are not. We're not going to judge those photos today. But I just want you to think about the types of things you're doing out there and remember that there are an awful lot of threats to wilderness and we don't want to become one of them. There's a very real potential for managers to become a threat to wilderness. Consider all the signs and markers that we put out there, some examples. Here's some more regulatory signs and interpretive features. I love this sign in the middle. If there's anybody here from the James River Face Wilderness, I think this is where this comes from. Maybe Pete remembers this. Suggested route of travel, danger, wrong way. It's a great sign. How about this? Infrastructure for recreation. We could argue about some of these things. The bridge is the biggest one I've ever seen. That's in the Bob Marshall. The ladder in the lower left is in a canyon in a BLM wilderness that Boy Scouts keep putting in. BLM keeps taking it out. Boy Scouts keep putting it in. And this has been going on for years. They just keep going back and forth on this thing. Chickees, the big burly structure in the top right, that's how you camp in a swamp. Though I think in this particular example, the roof and the picnic table were deemed a bit excessive and have been removed in this particular example, which I admire. But the platform was left as the minimum necessary for camping in a swamp. Interesting, right? Administrative features, research markers, communication sites, even our presence. Don't get me wrong, we should be there. We absolutely should be there, but never forget that we have an impact we have an impact. More of that impact. So this is motorized equipment and mechanical transport, right? Wheelbarrows or mechanical transport. I love that picture. Every agency is being picked on equally here. How about these? Some of these aren't even prohibited uses, right? But they still degrade wilderness character. And what's with that poor bear? You can see that bear from space. I don't know why he's got a big burly radio collar on and about a half a mile worth of flagging. I don't know why. Seedlings, that seems like a nice white hat project, right? Well, guess where white pine blister rust came from? We brought it in on seedlings. Oopsie. So the take-home message here, guys, is consider the cumulative impacts of all of this, sort of death by 1,000 cuts, and also the slippery slope. It's very easy for us to start off on one of these things and just keep building and building and building. I can't tell you how many trips I've taken through a big wilderness like the Bob, and I've encountered most of the things in these pictures on a single trip, sometimes in the first couple of days. Believe it, that totally kills your wilderness experience. There are real impacts from this. So my point is, I know we have work to do out there. We all do. Be mindful about how you do it. Be mindful about where you do it. And perhaps most importantly, be mindful about who else is out there doing their work. Do you have a weed crew out there? Do you have a fire crew out there? Do you have people out doing rehab, wildlife biologists, trail crew? You don't want to wind up beating the wilderness character right out of the place. And so we run the risk of becoming the enemy. Death by 1,000 cuts and slippery slope. Always be asking yourself if you can do better. What really is the minimum, whether it's a prohibited use or not, and whether it seems pretty benign or not. We should always be asking ourselves if we can do better. Do we really have to do this at all? And if we really do, is this the least impactful way to do it? Keep your eye on the ball, folks. Keep your eye on the ball. Okay, key points for this cornerstone. Wilderness is different. The law requires it to be managed differently. Don't lose that contrast. If you lose that contrast and wilderness ceases to become like other places, or rather becomes like other places, ceases to be different than other places, what's the point? You've already lost it. Prohibited uses can be exempted, but they compromise the intent of the law, so these decisions should not be taken lightly. Be aware of decision creep and cumulative impacts. Don't become the enemy. Be mindful of what you're doing. Be mindful of what everyone else out there is doing too. And as a wilderness manager, try to coordinate all of that. Make sure you know what's happening. Learn to think minimally. Retrain your brain. Whether you have to or not, always ask if you have to do something. And if so, what is the minimum? And some of the more experienced wilderness folks might recognize these two questions as the foundation for the MRA or the MRDG. Is action necessary is the first step, right? And if so, what is the minimum activity is the second step of those analyses. You should be asking those questions whether you're doing an analysis or not. Bob Marshall. For me and for thousands with similar inclinations, the most important passion of life is the overpowering desire to escape periodically from the clutches of a mechanistic civilization. That's sort of the point of this cornerstone. Americans are promised the opportunity to experience this. They're promised this in the law. Okay, fourth and final cornerstone, protect wilderness benefits. Section 2A starts right out talking about the benefits of the wilderness resource. In fact, this has been framed differently. I've been watching a lot of the presentations. It's been framed a little differently than I'm about to frame it, but I want you to think about this. Securing the benefits of wilderness is the purpose of the Wilderness Act. I'll say it again. Securing the benefits of wilderness is the purpose of the Wilderness Act. This is why we have wilderness. People say, oh no, it's preserve wilderness character. That is the primary administrative mandate. That is the means by which we achieve the purpose. I hope that makes sense. Keep your eye on the ball here too. Benefits. The notion that wilderness preservation brings human benefits is implicit in the ideology of the wilderness movement. And it's even more important today, I believe. It's part of who we are, it's part of our national identity, and it is why we have wilderness. There will be purists that will argue with you about that. You know what? It's okay. I mean, we chose to protect it because we perceive these benefits. I don't see anything wrong with that. These are human benefits. Wilderness is a human construct. So what? You know, you could argue the philosophy of that, but I mean, that's why we have it. And honor that. I don't see anything wrong with it. But what the heck are these benefits? The Wilderness Act doesn't tell us. It suggests that we're here to secure the benefits of wilderness for present and future generations. And by the way, we won't tell you what they are. But they did hint at it in a few places. Section 2A talks about use and enjoyment. That suggests certain types of benefits, right? Section 2C talks about these other features of value: ecological, geological, scientific, educational, scenic, historical values. That hints at certain kinds of benefits also. It's a little bit nebulous, but you can kind of see what they're getting at. Here's some more. This is even a little redundant. The public purposes of wilderness: recreational, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, and historical use. Again, hints at certain types of benefits, but really the law isn't clear about what these benefits are. I think there's a reason for that. The benefits of wilderness are whatever you think they are, as long as they're consistent with the preservation of wilderness character. This is a long laundry list of common answers. When I ask a live audience, you know, why do they value wilderness? These are often the answers. You could come up with others, I'm sure, and there's no wrong answer as long as it's consistent with the preservation of wilderness character. More importantly, what are the unique benefits of your wilderness? What's special about your wilderness? They're all different. Every wilderness occupies some kind of a niche in the National Wilderness Preservation System. If you don't know what it is, you better figure it out. If your job is to secure those benefits, you need to be able to articulate what they are. Ask people and then shout it from the rooftops. By the way, after I'm done with this cornerstone, Jason is going to give you some of the latest science on what these benefits might be. So stay tuned. I want to draw your attention to an apparent split here between two types of benefits, though, and this makes some interesting conversation. These I've circled in red are what's called biocentric values, biocentric benefits, which presume that wilderness benefits are derived from natural conditions. And they're very common answers when people talk about wilderness, among the most common answers. These are what's called anthropocentric values or benefits, and also very common. Some people only relate to these things. Who's right and who's wrong? Everybody's right? As long as it's consistent with the preservation of wilderness character, there's no wrong answer. The thing that's worth noting is probably all of you listening today fall into either a biocentric point of view or an anthropocentric point of view, with probably a rare few of you straddling the line. Most of you probably fall on one side or the other. It's worth trying to figure out which side you're on, for no reason except that it affects your decision making. You know, if you value these things more than these things, you'll tend to make decisions that favor these things. Am I making you dizzy yet? Let me see if I can illustrate that for you.
I think you're right on this right now, but we have a good question is, why is it that we must align wilderness with its human benefits in order for us to value it? So I think you'll be getting into that here shortly, but wanted to just share that question with you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I was trying to hint at that. There are two philosophies with respect to wilderness benefits, and one of them is wilderness has intrinsic value regardless of any value we assign to it, right? That's certainly true. I wouldn't argue that point, but I would argue that the reason we protected it, the reason we wrote the Wilderness Act, the reason we continue to preserve wilderness character is because we do perceive human benefits. And people, when you ask people why they value wilderness, that you don't get the just because, which is kind of what you'd hope to get because it's there. You get a host of other answers. And so I don't know if that answers your question, and maybe Jason can talk about that a little bit more, but there's definitely a philosophical split there. The bottom line is I'm arguing that we have wilderness for more practical purposes. We're humans, we're rather self-serving. It's just the nature of our species. We protect wilderness because we perceive benefits to humans. That's why we chose to do it. That may not be the answer you want to hear, but I think it's the right answer. Anyway, I'll move right along here and we can talk about that a little more if there's time. It's an interesting conversation. If you are a biocentrist and you favor the protection of natural conditions over anything else, you may be inclined to restrict visitors or even keep them out, right? Because every boot print matters. On the other hand, if you're an anthropocentrist and you favor outstanding opportunities more than anything else, you may be inclined to say, well, you know what, we're just going to forego natural conditions and open the place up to whatever people want to do with it. Fact is, you can't really be on either extreme. The Wilderness Act recognizes both of these sets of values. These are both part of wilderness character. You cannot ignore either one of them. And I would argue that if you're on either extreme, you're not doing the job well. You're probably showing your biases. And this is the reason to understand your own biases. You need to be, kind of balanced depending on the situation and the location. You need to, depending on what's going on, you may float a little left or you may float a little right, but you should never go off too far either direction. I hope that makes sense. I've uploaded a values, or rather, yeah, it's a values questionnaire. I forget what I called it. That will help you on your own time assess where you are on this continuum. And you might be surprised. I always thought I was a biocentrist, but I actually measured out a little further on the right. Okay, key points of this cornerstone. Many important human benefits are derived from wilderness preservation. It's why we have it. Don't be ashamed of that. Shout it from the rooftops, educate the public, educate your own ranks. Oh, I just said that, sorry. All benefits present must be protected, assuming they're consistent with the preservation of wilderness character. That's really important. They have to be consistent with the preservation of wilderness character. But if they are, they're a valid benefit. They're a valid value of wilderness. Doesn't matter what it is. Benefits can conflict. When they do, you're going to find yourself in a difficult position, and you're going to have to weigh impacts to one benefit to preserve another. Hopefully you're not going too far either direction. This is very much like the wildness versus naturalness question, right? You can't throw either one of these things out the window. You have to try to maximize both of them. And that is the art and the science of wilderness stewardship. It's probably as much art as science. And I'll end this cornerstone with a quote from Wallace Stegner. Something will have gone out of us as a people if we ever allow the remaining wilderness to be destroyed. I think it says volumes about us as Americans that we decided to pass the Wilderness Act in the first place. I think it's part of our national identity. I think it's part of our natural heritage. And I can't imagine not having it. I just can't. I grew up with it like many other people, and I just can't imagine not having it. And what would it say about us if we ever decided to do away with it? I don't want to think about that, and that's a rhetorical question, but I just want to leave that thought in your head so we have something for Jason to talk about. So remember the four cornerstones of wilderness character. They're designed to help you preserve wilderness character. So every decision that you're making or every decision that you're helping a line officer make, pass through these filters. See where it comes out. This is a really good way to gut check anything. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your time. It's a great time to transition over to Jason. Jason, if you'll pick up with wilderness benefits and dive into some of the science, that'll put a nice cap on this.
All right. Thanks again, Ken. Just want to say hello to everyone and greetings from Missoula, Montana. I'm Jason Taylor, Director of the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. Today, I hope to accomplish two things. One is to provide a very brief and just a single slide level introduction to the Leopold Institute. And then I want to share a bit of current research related to the benefits of wilderness. And I'll do so by providing a primer of a forthcoming report, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. But before I launch in, I want to send along a plug for the session, a session that I'm going to be a part of on Thursday morning. It's a wilderness research coffee hour. And so I'm going to do a one-slide introduction to the Leopold Institute today. On Thursday morning, I'll spend 20 minutes introducing the Leopold Institute and wilderness research, kind of interagency research that we're working on at the Institute, and then take all kind of questions and just hope to have a great dialogue around wilderness research. So if you don't get enough today and the one slide introduction, please come back Thursday morning and we'll take a deeper dive. All right, so the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute is a national interagency federal research facility located on campus at the University of Montana. And it's certainly true that many people in the Forest Service and elsewhere across the globe and around the United States conduct wilderness relevant science. But we're the only federal research group in the United States wholly dedicated to science to support wilderness stewardship. So our purpose is to advance wilderness stewardship through transformational science for the entire national wilderness preservation system, all 111 million acres, 800 plus units, the many hundreds of managers that manage or that steward or charge of stewarding the national wilderness preservation system, for all of you, for other stewards of wilderness at home and internationally. So it's a small charge, but there are some mighty goals there. We may never reach the desired endpoint, but we're going to continue trying. All right, so an example of the kind of work we do or facilitate is a forthcoming report on the benefits of wilderness. And hopefully this adds value or builds on the benefits cornerstone that Ken introduced. But again, it's just a primer. So the work was initiated in 2014 when the Wilderness Act turned 50. The effort was funded by and included experts from all four National Wilderness Preservation System bureaus, so the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Forest Service. And we'll share this report broadly when it becomes available, and we're in the final stages here. Hopefully it's going to be released very soon, sometime within the next couple months. It's important to share, not the least of which because of the questions that have been asked over the last hour. It's important to share that this report has an economic focus. And in part, so does this talk, the benefits of wilderness from an economic perspective. But to be very clear, we get economic value from wilderness. We do not manage wilderness for economic value. So it's a very important distinction. I'll say it one more time. We get economic value from wilderness. We do not manage wilderness for economic value. All right, so a quick look inside the front cover of the report. It's 10 chapters long and nearly 200 pages. Covers topics from the social relevance of wilderness to economic impacts, to use trends, to tribal values, and so on. And today, I'm only going to introduce a few of the ideas from the report and hope that you're inspired to read more once the report's available. You might guess, I mean, the Wilderness Act has been around for quite some time, right? Over 50 years, nearing 60. And there's been wilderness in the United States since 1924. You might guess that questions about relevance or benefits of wilderness would have been addressed long ago. So following that assumption, you might ask, why then do we need to study the benefits of wilderness today? Why was there this 5 or 7 year effort to understand the benefits of wilderness today? So it is absolutely true that there has been research on the benefits of wilderness for many decades. So in addition to broad scale drivers that can impact benefits, so think about things like climate change and pollution, perceptions around the benefits of wilderness are driven by personal relationships with nature or your favorite wilderness area, and by culture, as Ken mentioned, by people, among other drivers. That is, wilderness in the sense of the National Wilderness Preservation System is a social construct. and therefore benefits are determined by people. So as people's perspectives change or vary by place or through time, thoughts about the benefits of wilderness can change. It's an ever-evolving matter that needs constant attention. So to the point about people changing, the age demographics of our country are changing. So populations of the silent generation and the baby boomers, those who were the early users of the then newly created National Wilderness Preservation System, are in decline. And millennials are now the most populous generation and are projected to be, of course. Simultaneously, across most generations, participation in nature-based recreation is steadily trending upward. Simply put, more people are outdoors seeking nature. Also, at the same time, our country's cultural demographics are changing. When the Wilderness Act was signed in 1964, more than 80% of Americans were white and non-Hispanic. By around 2045, white non-Hispanic people are expected to make up less than 50% of the United States population. Looking a few more years forward, and roughly 100 years after the signing of the Wilderness Act, it's anticipated that Hispanic populations will comprise nearly 25% of the population, and Asians will comprise about 14%. Black populations as a proportion of the total population have historically and are projected to remain relatively constant. The point here is, and on the last few slides, is our population is changing, and therefore potential wilderness users and perceptions about wilderness benefits are or could be changing. This is one of the reasons why we need to study the benefits of wilderness today, and we'll need to do so into the future. Okay, so let's take a look at wilderness uses, users, and preferences roughly over the last decade, from 2005 to 2014. Everything I'm going to present to you, the rest of the slides here over the next 8 to 10 minutes are data excerpted from this Benefits of Wilderness report. So all the source data, all the source information, more details about everything I'm going to just gloss over or introduce as a primer to you can be found in that report. So using national visitor use data, which is collected in or from Forest Service wilderness visitation. So it's worth noting that these results don't represent users across all bureaus, but we assume that the relative change through time across the bureaus is representative. So the report looks at use and users in a number of ways. Most broadly, we know that wilderness use increased from 6.5 million to 8.3 million visits from 2005 to 2014. This certainly varied by region, as you can see in the slides there. But all told, visits increased by just over 27% during this period, again, 2005 to 2014. And the first figure in the upper left, and digging a little deeper on this matter of use and users and preferences, we know that most wilderness users remain white, non-Hispanic, but importantly, use by several minority groups has increased by about 35%. In the lower left, data show that a good number of people live nearby wilderness, which certainly brings opportunity and challenges. And an equal number of people are willing to travel long distances to access wilderness. I'll come back to this point in a few slides here. Lastly, if we look at the preferences in the table on the right, things like relaxing, viewing nature and water sports uses reduced marginally during the study period. Backpacking and hunting reduced notably. And at the same time, day use in the form of hiking and walking showed the greatest change, increasing by 6%. In fact, day use in wilderness remains the most common use of wilderness areas in the 2020s. So moving away from national trends to a local case study, maybe some of you are here this summer. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is a 1.1 million acre wilderness area managed by the Forest Service in the north central part of the United States in the state of Minnesota. The data I shared earlier suggested that people are willing to travel a long way to visit wilderness. The same is true in this case. Greater than 97% of the sampled Boundary Waters visitors were from outside of the region, and many were from across the United States and from other countries. The point is, people are willing to travel a long way to engage in wilderness. Annual visitation to the Boundary Waters Wilderness spurred some 1,100 full and part-time jobs and generated almost $30 million of labor income. Considering both labor income and other economic factors, for example, recirculation of money in the local economy, annual visitation to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness generates roughly $80 million in economic output annually. And just for comparison, these economic effects are on par with multi-day rafting trips in the Grand Canyon. So zooming back out nationally, on the left there, data suggests that over the last 3 decades, Western United States counties nearby wilderness experienced in-migration, which means their populations grew by 8.2% on average over those decades, while counties without wilderness averaged 0 growth. Certainly this trend varied through time, as you can see on the slide there, but when you break down individual decades, it remains consistent that counties with wilderness are growing faster than those without wilderness. So this phenomena is known as amenity migration, where people are choosing to move their households closer to natural amenities, in this case, wilderness areas. So as shown in the upper right, data also suggests that counties with more wilderness have more seasonal or vacation housing, attract more migration from urban areas, and have higher housing values. There are 2 more benefits that I want to quickly introduce you to or draw your attention to. The first is carbon storage. So as many of you will already know, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, right? That's emitted by human activities. And the release of carbon into the atmosphere has significant negative impacts on our climate. Conversely, storing carbon in nature, in the ground, within trees, in aquatic systems, can help to mitigate climate change. The slide here shows carbon cycles in the northern region of the United States on public lands, with the yellow and green areas representing carbon storage, or net carbon storage, the dark green areas being those with the most carbon stored. The orange and red represent carbon being released into the atmosphere. So when you consider such data across the entire country in this study period from 2002 to 2005, the amount of carbon sequestered annually in wilderness areas was roughly equal to all other public lands managed by the BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and National Park Service combined when you consider carbon storage on a per acre basis. And if you consider the social value of carbon, or the financial aspect of keeping carbon locked up in nature, the average annual economic value of carbon sequestered within the National Wilderness Preservation System is $2.2 billion annually. The bottom line here, wilderness is important for carbon storage and for mitigating climate change. It's a significant benefit provided by the Wilderness Preservation System. The other benefit that I want to mention is the value of wilderness to water systems. So a disproportionately high percentage of the nation's renewable supply of surface freshwater flows from wilderness versus other lands, keeping in mind that less than about 3% of the lower 48 is designated wilderness. In some regions of the West, shown in the dark green here, between 20 and 25% of the freshwater runoff comes from wilderness, hence the disproportionate part. The idea of where water comes from is important relative to climate change for sure, as water sources around the globe for both humans and wildlife will be impacted, but also from a day-to-day perspective, considering where water comes from when people turn on their faucets. To that point, 21 states have at least one wilderness area watershed in the top 90th percentile of all watersheds for drinking water importance. And 34 of the 48 of the lower 48 states have a wilderness area watershed in the top half of all watersheds for drinking water importance. Simply put, again, wilderness areas are important for providing drinking water, especially in the mountainous regions, even in the eastern United States. Just a few final thoughts from me, and then we'll have some time for questions here. Wilderness areas are overlaid upon the traditional homelands of American Indian tribes and Alaska Natives. Please remember this as you go about your work this summer. So today, as Ken mentioned, wilderness is part of our national identity. It's also part of tribal identities and provides myriad benefits to all Americans, from spiritual renewal and recreation opportunity to clean air and water, wildlife habitat, and food and economic security. So the benefits of wilderness are many, and as noted, ever evolving. These benefits are often achieved only through deliberate management action or inaction by those charged with their stewardship. As a reminder, that's us. We are charged with their stewardship. We all have a critical role to play to ensure wilderness resources and values endure. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jason and Ken. Like to open it up to questions now. We have about 9 minutes left, and if you would like to either raise your hand and come off of mute or put something in the chat, we would love to hear from you. Pull the chat back up here. There we go. And Laura, your hand is up, but I think that might be from early in our discussion, but wanted to check and see if you had a question. Oh, okay, that was a legacy hand. Any questions?
I have a point of clarification.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, guys, I couldn't see the whole chat window when I was going through my presentation, but I see there was a little bit of discussion about wilderness as a recreation resource. And I just want to make it really clear that while wilderness is a recreation resource, it is much, much, much more than that. That is only one of many things that it is. And so I get really nervous when people start to perceive it as only a recreation resource or to be managed to emphasize recreation opportunities. It's not my intent to convey that at all. In fact, the truth is the opposite. We should be balancing recreation with all of the other parts of wilderness to preserve wilderness character as a whole. So recreation is, wilderness recreation is part of wilderness character, but a lot of other things are too. And I just think we need to keep that in perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. We had a couple questions, Jason. Oh, let's see. 1 second, Pete. When do we expect the report to be available, and where would they be able to access that, Jason?
Yeah, thanks for that. I was just typing a reply in the chat there, but this is faster. So the report is actually done now. At least we believe it's done, or we hope it's done. It's currently being reviewed, a review conducted by the Office of Tribal Relations and by the Forest Service Washington Office Research and Development. So as soon as they finish their final reviews, we'll make the report available, and it'll be available certainly on Forest Service Tree Search. All of the regional program managers and the wilderness programs will have access to that. So we'll make an effort to distribute the report broadly through wilderness channels and make sure we get it to district rangers and forest supervisors and so forth. And so if it doesn't come directly to you via email, it will be available on the Forest Service Tree Search site and also on the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research website, which is just leopold.wilderness.net. We'll make sure it's available there too.
Thanks, Jason. Pete, go ahead.
Thanks, Nancy. And you are missed in Region 9.
miss
This
you
builds
guys.
on what Ken said, but it's more directed to Jason. I think, you know, I've quoted some Ken Cordell studies extensively over the years that show recreation as one of the lower tier of values for a lot of people, that 212 different values of wilderness study, but that thing's getting some age on it now. Is there some ongoing work that in that same regard, sort of that social science, what people perceive the most important values of wilderness to be? And I'll thank you in advance.
Yeah, Pete, thanks for the question. The short answer is I don't know. That line of inquiry doesn't show up in the benefits of wilderness report. It's touched on peripherally, but there's not a deep dive on that topic in the report. I will lean back on social scientists, my social scientist group at the Leopold Institute, and get an answer to that, and I'll reach out and let you know. Sorry, I don't have a more specific answer now.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks.
Sure.
Other questions? There's a couple of good comments here from Ken, and don't forget the other agencies. And yeah, other questions anyone wants to share? We've got a couple more minutes. I am going to put that survey link in the chat again. If you can take a couple minutes before the next event, which I'll talk about in just a second. Oh, Pete, go ahead.
I saw Stephen raising his hand, and I know you're busy and may not have seen it, Nancy.
You are correct. Thank you. Stephen, go ahead.
Thanks, Pete. I couldn't find the raise my hand button. I'm the host and I couldn't find that.
It's all right.
Jason, I was wondering if you might be able to spend a couple minutes highlighting some of the tribal benefits in the report, if that's possible. If you know. Yeah,
so I had there was a slide on tribal benefits originally in my presentation. Then I felt a little uncomfortable representing a tribal perspective as I am not a tribal member. And so a short summary in the kind of in the words of the author, who is a member of the tribal, Linda Moon Stump. Not on the benefits so much, but the opportunities going forward. And that is that there has been a significant amount of strife historically when you think about management of federal wilderness areas and tribal values and benefits. And I think right now, especially where we are in society, that there's an opportunity for us that maybe hasn't existed in the past to build some bridges and to recognize opportunities and ways for co-producing and for being more inclusive in management of wilderness areas. And so that's recognized in the tribal values chapter, that there is this history that exists, but there are commonalities in purpose between tribal uses and values of wilderness and what you find in the Wilderness Act. And there are opportunities, relationships being built, and opportunities to strengthen those relationships that we maybe have not had in the past. And so I don't really want to say more because I don't want to misrepresent a tribal perspective as I'm not a tribal member. But the chapter that's in the report is a very honest reflection of a hard history, and also an honest reflection of opportunities that are in front of us now. So hopefully that's helpful, Stephen.
Yes, it is. And thank you for all of that and your acknowledgements. And it's inspiring and means a lot to hear coming from someone as high level as you, that building bridges, new bridges, and incorporating more perspectives is a goal and seen as an opportunity that's been missed. So
Yeah, I will talk more about this, the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion topic on Thursday morning. So if you're around, stop in.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Well, I just want to extend a really hearty thank you to Ken and Jason, and also to Stephen, who hosted the session from SWS.